was excited to start his freshman year at college. It was his first taste of real independence, and he'd been looking forward to it all summer. He just finished unpacking when his new roommate, Dale, arrived. Dan tried to keep an open mind, but his first impression was strange. Dale was tall, thin, and didn't make eye contact. When Dan reached out to shake his hand, Dale stared at it, almost as if he didn't know what to do. Finally, he reached out and gave a weak, limp handshake. Awkward silence filled the room as Dan tried to make small talk, but Dale only answered in single words, nodding or shaking his head. Within minutes, the tension was so thick that Dan gave up trying to talk. He sat on his bed, scrolling through his phone, sneaking glances at Dale every now and then. Dale sat on his bed, silently staring at his laptop screen. Hours passed, and neither of them spoke. Dan thought he could handle a quiet roommate, but Dale felt different, like someone who had more secrets than he let on. As the evening wore on, Dan decided to call it a night, so he turned off his bedside lamp, hoping that Dale would take the hint and do the same. But Dale didn't turn off his laptop. He kept staring, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen well into the night. Dan struggled to fall asleep, feeling the eerie presence of his roommate just a few feet away. Finally, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off. Hours later, he woke up suddenly. He wasn't sure why, but something felt off. The moonlight was filtering into the room, casting strange shadows. Then, his heart stopped. Dale was sitting on the edge of Dan's bed, staring at him. Dan sat up, rubbing his eyes, hoping it was just a nightmare. "Dale, what the hell are you doing?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dale just whispered, "Sorry," and slinked back to his bed without another word. Dan lay awake for the rest of the night, his mind racing with unease. Who was this guy, and why was he acting so strange? The next day, Dan tried to brush it off, telling himself Dale was just socially awkward. But as he returned to the dorm that afternoon, his stomach twisted. His things were out of place. Clothes slightly shifted, his backpack unzipped, and his laptop open on his desk. Dan could have sworn he'd left it closed and password protected. As he sat down and opened it, he noticed something else. All of his emails had been opened, including ones he hadn't read yet. Every folder on his desktop had been clicked through. He spun around, facing Dale, who was lying on his bed, scrolling on his phone like nothing was wrong. Dan confronted him, asking if he'd gone through his things. Dale looked up, a slight smile flickering at the corners of his mouth, and replied in a low, hollow voice. No, the response was almost instant, too quick, and something about the way he said it sent chills down Dan's spine. It was like Dale could read him like a book, feeding off his fear. Dan couldn't sleep that night, or the night after that. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel Dale's presence, like he was just waiting for the right moment to watch him again. Finally, Dan requested a room change. He was moved across campus, relieved to put Dale behind him. But on his first night in his new room, he woke to a familiar feeling. At first, he thought it was just paranoia, until he heard the sound, a soft, metallic clicking at the door. He crept to the peephole, barely breathing. There, in the dim light of the hallway, he saw someone crouched by his door, fiddling with the handle. As his eyes adjusted, he recognized that twisted smile. It was Dale, grinning through the crack of the door. His eyes locked onto the peephole. Dan pulled back, heart racing, as he called campus security. When they arrived, Dale was gone, leaving behind only faint scratches on the doorknob. Dan never saw him again. Binghamton University was beautiful in the fall. The air was crisp, the leaves were a fiery red, and the campus had an almost magical quality. It was a Friday night, just a few weeks into October, when three friends, Mike, James, and Kyle, decided to go exploring. They knew of a secluded spot by the lake, deep in the school's nature preserve. Few students knew about it, and those who did mostly went to smoke or hang out away from campus security. Armed with a backpack full of beers, the three friends made their way through the dense forest, talking and laughing as they reached their destination. The clearing was perfect for their night out, private, far from the prying eyes of campus security, and with a clear view of the lake shimmering under the moonlight. They built a small fire, cracking open their drinks and letting the conversation flow, talking about everything and nothing as the fire crackled. The forest around them seemed alive, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted, the laughter died down, and a strange feeling settled over them, a prickling awareness that they weren't alone. Suddenly, they heard it, a faint crunch of leaves, like someone walking. They paused, listening, their laughter fading. Each of them held their breath as they waited, hoping it was just an animal or the wind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a footstep, a heavy, deliberate step. One of them, trying to stay calm, whispered, "Maybe it's just campus security?" They tossed their beer cans into the bushes, scanning the darkness. But the footsteps didn't sound like campus security. It was too slow, too deliberate, like someone stalking them. And then, without warning, a branch snapped close by. The noise was so loud, it sounded like it was only feet away. The three friends huddled closer, hearts pounding. Whatever it was circling them, weaving through the trees in a slow, taunting rhythm. Out of nowhere, a large branch flew from the shadows, landing with a loud thud in the center of their circle. They froze, exchanging terrified glances, until one of them bolted, his footsteps disappearing into the woods. The other two stood there, unsure of whether to laugh or scream. And then, another branch flew from the darkness, striking one of them in the arm. Panic took over, and they grabbed their things, racing back through the trees toward the campus lights. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, they paused, catching their breath. But as they looked back, they saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. The figure watched them, unmoving, waiting. They never saw a face, just the silhouette, and the sense that whoever, or whatever, it was had been waiting for them all along. Sarah had just begun to feel at home in her college dorm, a cozy little room tucked away in a centuries-old building. The creaks and groans of the structure were a comforting reminder of its history. Yet, as the weeks went by, something unsettling began to disrupt her nights. It started one fateful night around midnight. A faint, rhythmic click echoed down the hallway, slithering under her door like a snake. At first, she brushed it off, assuming it was just another late-night student stumbling through the halls. But as the nights turned into weeks, that sound morphed into something more sinister. An insistent, almost mocking rhythm, creeping closer to her door each time. One evening, just after 2 in the morning, the sound returned, louder and more unnerving than before. It felt as if something, or someone, was testing her doorknob, the metal twisting and clicking like a sinister code. Panic clawed at her throat, and she pulled the covers tightly around her, hoping to drown out the noise. But the sound only intensified. She could hear the faint scraping of nails against the wood, a chilling whisper against the silence of the night. Heart racing, Sarah summoned her courage and tiptoed to the door, peering through the peephole. Her breath caught in her throat as she caught a glimpse of a figure standing just inches away, a shadow cloaked in darkness, leaning toward her door as if it were listening for her every breath. Click, click. The sound continued, and her body froze. This wasn't a prank. It felt calculated, like a predator toying with its prey. Desperation flooded her as she scrambled for her phone, hands trembling as she dialed campus security. "There's someone outside my door," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can hear them. Please hurry." The operator reassured her that help was on the way, but as she hung up, the noise abruptly stopped. An eerie silence enveloped her room, thick and suffocating. She dared another look through the peephole, heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. The hallway was empty, almost too still. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Relief washed over her as the security guard arrived, flashlight slicing through the darkness. He scanned the corridor, his eyes darting from one shadow to another, searching for any sign of the intruder. "Did you see anyone?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "No one," he replied, shaking his head. But just then, he paused, his gaze fixed on her door. "Wait a second, did you notice these?" He pointed to the doorframe. Sarah leaned closer, her heart sinking as she spotted long, jagged scratches etched into the wood, stretching from the doorknob down to the floor. The marks were faint but undeniable, like the desperate clawing of something trying to break in. A cold wave of fear washed over her as she realized someone had indeed been trying to get inside. "Maybe just a prank," the officer said, but his voice lacked conviction. That night, Sarah left her lights on, lying wide awake in her bed, ears straining for the sound that had haunted her nights. The clicks never returned, but the silence felt heavier, suffocating. Each time she passed her door, she glanced at the scratches, her mind racing with questions. Who had stood there? What had they wanted? As days turned into weeks, the memory of that night lingered like a dark shadow over her. She could never shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just beyond her door, waiting, watching, forever just out of sight.